December 15th, 1944. The frozen hills of eastern Belgium trembled beneath a blanket of fresh snow as dawn struggled to break through the heavy grey clouds. Along a narrow forest road near the village of Malmedy, 760 American soldiers from the 106th Infantry Division believed they were settling into a quiet defensive position for the winter. They had no idea that within hours, their names would either be carved into marble memorials across the Atlantic, or they would owe their lives to the conscience of a child they would never meet. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded in those critical hours was not decided by generals or intelligence officers, but by a 16-year-old Belgian girl named Marie Delacroix, whose single act of defiance would transform the course of an entire military operation and prove that in the machinery of conflict, individual humanity could still bend the arc of history. The morning began like so many others in occupied Belgium. Marie woke in the cold darkness of her family's farmhouse, her breath visible in the frigid air of her small bedroom. Through the frost-covered window, she could see the pale outline of bare trees against the lightening sky. Her father, Henri Delacroix, a 52-year-old former schoolteacher, was already awake downstairs. She could hear the careful, quiet movements of someone trying not to draw attention, even in his own home. For 4 years, the Delacroix family had lived under occupation. Their farm, positioned on a hillside overlooking the main road between Malmedy and Stavelot, had become a strategic observation point. German forces had commandeered their barn 3 months earlier, using it as a supply depot and communications relay station. A rotating garrison of 12 soldiers lived there, young men mostly, some barely older than Marie herself. Among them was Oberleutnant Klaus Zimmermann, a 28-year-old signals officer from Munich. Unlike many of his comrades, Zimmermann treated the Delacroix family with a measure of courtesy that bordered on kindness. He had forbidden his men from entering the main house without permission. He ensured that Marie's younger brother, 10-year-old Thomas, received medical attention when he developed pneumonia in November. And in quiet moments, when he thought no one was watching, Marie had seen him stare at the photograph of 2 small children he kept in his breast pocket, his face etched with a sadness that transcended nationality. On this particular morning, Marie was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when she noticed unusual activity around the barn. Vehicles had arrived during the night, including 2 covered transport trucks and a command car. Officers she had never seen before were conferring in urgent tones, their voices carrying across the frozen yard in sharp bursts of vapor. Zimmermann stood among them, his expression grave. Marie moved closer, pretending to search for eggs in the outdoor nesting boxes her father had built along the barn's southern wall. Her knowledge of German, learned secretly from her father during the occupation, allowed her to catch fragments of the conversation. What she heard filled her with a dread that had nothing to do with the December cold. The senior officer, a hard-faced man with colonel's insignia, was outlining an operation. American forces had established a defensive position along the forest road, approximately 3 kilometers to the west. Intelligence indicated they were undermanned. Their attention focused on the expected line of advance further north. A strike force was being assembled, not for direct engagement, but for what the colonel called a necessary tactical solution. The American position would be surrounded during the night. At dawn, they would be given one opportunity to surrender. If they refused, the forest road would become their final resting place. 760 men, the colonel said. The number hung in the cold air with terrible finality. Marie's hands trembled as she clutched the egg basket. She understood what was being planned. She understood the terrible arithmetic of it. And she understood with a clarity that seemed to burn through the fog of fear that she was perhaps the only person in a position to prevent it. Zimmermann noticed her then. His eyes met hers across the yard, and for a moment she was certain he could read every thought in her head. He said something to the colonel and walked toward her with measured steps. "Marie," he said quietly in French, "you should return to the house. It is very cold this morning." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and turned toward the farmhouse. But his next words stopped her. "These are difficult times," he continued, still speaking French. "Sometimes we must all make choices we never imagined we would face. Remember that the consequences of such choices extend far beyond ourselves." She looked back at him. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes, something desperate and pleading, told her that he knew exactly what she had overheard. And more than that, he was giving her a warning, or perhaps permission, or possibly both. Inside the house, Marie found her father in the kitchen, preparing their meager breakfast of dark bread and ersatz coffee. Henri Delacroix had aged a decade in 4 years of occupation. His hair had gone completely grey, and his hands shook with a tremor that no amount of warmth could ease. But his eyes, when Marie told him what she had heard, became sharp and focused with the clarity of purpose he had once brought to teaching history to village children. "They have perhaps 12 hours," he said, speaking so softly that Marie had to lean close to hear. "The American position is 3 kilometers west. To reach it and return before the German patrols notice your absence would require at least 6 hours, most of it through frozen forest. The risk is absolute." Marie already knew this. She had spent the last 20 minutes considering exactly such calculations. The German patrols followed predictable patterns. There was a gap in their surveillance between 1400 hours and 1600 hours, when shifts changed and attention flagged. If she left by 1430 hours, moved quickly through the forest using the deer trails she had known since childhood, she might reach the American lines by 1700 hours. The return journey in darkness would be far more dangerous. "Papa," she said, 760 men. Henri closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright with tears he refused to shed. "I cannot tell you to do this, Marie. I cannot send my daughter into such danger, but I also cannot tell you not to try. The weight of this choice must be yours alone." Marie thought of Thomas, still weak from his bout with pneumonia, sleeping upstairs. She thought of her mother, who had passed away 2 years earlier when the medicine they needed was diverted to military use. She thought of the photograph in Zimmermann's pocket, those 2 children who might never see their father again, just as she had lost her mother. And she thought of 760 American soldiers, men who had crossed an ocean to fight for the liberation of her country, who were now sitting in a forest position, believing they were safe, sharing photographs of their own families, writing letters they assumed would reach home. "I will go," she said. The next hours passed with excruciating slowness. Marie prepared methodically, dressing in dark wool clothing and her warmest boots. She packed a small bag with bread and a flask of water. Her father gave her his compass and a hand-drawn map showing the safest route through the forest. They did not speak much. Words seemed insufficient for what was passing between them. At 1420 hours, Marie slipped out of the house through the root cellar, emerging in a small grove of pine trees that blocked the sightline from the barn. The afternoon was brutally cold, the temperature well below freezing. Fresh snow from the previous night had covered the ground to a depth of nearly 15 centimeters, making each step a challenge. She moved quickly through the forest, following the deer trails that wound between the ancient trees. Her breath came in ragged gasps that crystallized in the air. Several times she heard the distant sound of engines and had to crouch motionless in the underbrush, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would give her away. German supply convoys passed on the parallel road, their sounds carrying through the winter stillness. By 1630 hours, Marie was nearly 2 kilometers from home. Her feet had gone numb despite the thick wool socks. Her hands, even inside gloves, ached with cold, but she pushed forward, driven by the image of 760 men who would be lost at dawn if she failed. It was 17:15 hours when she finally heard American voices. They came from ahead and to the left, young men speaking English in casual tones that suggested they felt secure in their position. Marie approached slowly, her hands raised, calling out in the broken English her father had taught her. "Please do not shoot. I am Belgian. I have important information." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within seconds she was surrounded by soldiers, their weapons trained on her, their faces a mixture of suspicion and confusion. A young lieutenant, who could not have been more than 22 years old, stepped forward. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you doing here?" "My name is Marie Delacroix," she said, the English words coming slowly but clearly. "German forces plan to attack you tomorrow at dawn. 760 of you will be surrounded. You must leave this position tonight." The lieutenant exchanged glances with his sergeant, a hard-bitten man in his 30s named Jack Morrison. The suspicion in their eyes was palpable. They had been warned about infiltrators, about tricks designed to make them abandon strategic positions. "How do you know this?" Morrison asked, his voice rough with skepticism. "Why should we believe you?" Marie explained about the farm, about the commandeered barn, about the officers she had seen that morning. She described the colonel's insignia, the type of vehicles, the specific route they planned to use for the encirclement. She spoke with desperate urgency, knowing that every minute wasted was a minute closer to dawn. But Morrison was unmoved. "This could be a trap," he said to the lieutenant. "Classic infiltration tactic. Make us abandon a good defensive position, then hit us while we are exposed on the road." The lieutenant nodded slowly. "I am sorry," he said to Marie. "We cannot risk the safety of our entire unit on the word of a civilian who appears out of the forest. For all we know, you are working with them." Marie felt desperation rising in her chest like a physical force. "Please," she said. "Please, you must believe me. I have risked everything to warn you, my father, my brother. They will be in terrible danger when the German forces discover what I have done. I would not do this if it were not true." But she could see the decision had been made. The lieutenant ordered 2 soldiers to escort her to a holding area, a small dugout where prisoners and suspicious civilians were detained for questioning. They were not unkind, but they were firm. Marie found herself sitting on a cold wooden bench, watched by a young private who looked almost as frightened as she felt. An hour passed, then another. Marie could hear the soldiers going about their business, fortifying their positions, joking with each other, completely unaware of the doom that was approaching. She tried several times to explain again, but the private guarding her had strict orders. No talking. It was 1900 hours when everything changed. A runner arrived at the command post, breathless and urgent. Long-range reconnaissance had picked up unusual movement in the German rear areas, large-scale troop movements, artillery being repositioned, patterns consistent with preparation for a major operation. The lieutenant came to the dugout himself. His face had lost its earlier confidence. "Tell me again," he said to Marie. "Everything you heard, every detail." She repeated her story, and this time he listened with absolute attention. When she described the colonel's insignia and the specific timing of the planned attack, he went pale. "Morrison," he called out, "get Major Hendricks, now." Within 30 minutes, the American position was in controlled chaos. Major Richard Hendricks, the battalion commander, had made the decision Marie had prayed for. They would withdraw under cover of darkness, moving to a fallback position 5 kilometers south. It would be difficult, moving 760 men with all their equipment through frozen forest in complete darkness. But it was possible, and it was their only chance. Hendricks himself came to see Marie. He was a man in his early 40s with iron-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much of this conflict. "Thank you," he said simply. "If what you say is true, you have saved a great many lives tonight." "If it is not true," Morrison added grimly, "we have just abandoned a strategic position and endangered this entire operation." Marie met his eyes steadily. "It is true," she said. "You will see." The withdrawal began at 2000 hours. Marie watched as the soldiers moved out in disciplined columns, each man helping the next, equipment packed with practiced efficiency. They offered to take her with them, but she refused. Her family was still at the farm. If she did not return, the German forces would know immediately that someone had betrayed their plans. Her father and Thomas would pay the price. Lieutenant Morrison gave her a chocolate bar from his personal rations. "For your journey back," he said. His voice was softer now, touched with something that might have been admiration or guilt or both. "You are either the bravest person I've ever met or the most foolish. Possibly both." Marie tucked the chocolate into her pocket and prepared for the return journey. Major Hendricks gave her a sealed letter. "If we survive tomorrow," he said, "this letter will ensure that people know what you did. If we do not, then perhaps it will not matter. But either way, the 106th Infantry Division owes you a debt we can never repay." The journey back was a nightmare. In the darkness, The deer trails were nearly impossible to follow. Several times Marie became disoriented, wandering in circles until she could relocate familiar landmarks by moonlight. The temperature had dropped further, and her earlier tracks had been covered by fresh snowfall. Her feet were numb blocks of ice. Her hands could barely grip the tree branches she used to pull herself forward. It was nearly midnight when she finally saw the lights of the farm. She approached cautiously, terrified that her absence had been discovered. But the house was dark and quiet. She slipped back through the root cellar entrance and found her father waiting in the kitchen, a single candle burning on the table. They did not speak. Henri simply wrapped his daughter in a blanket and held her while she wept from exhaustion and terror and relief. Only when her shaking had subsided did he whisper, "You have done something extraordinary, my brave girl. Now we must pray it was enough." Dawn came cold and clear. Marie woke to the sound of engines and shouted commands. The strike force was assembling in the yard, preparing to move toward the American position. She watched from her window as Zimmermann emerged from the barn, his face drawn and tense. The convoy moved out at 0600 hours. Marie and her family waited in terrible suspense, knowing that within the next few hours they would learn whether 760 men would survive or be lost, whether Marie's forbidden act had changed anything at all. The German forces returned at 1100 hours. The convoy was intact, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Soldiers jumped from the trucks with expressions of confusion and frustration. Officers gathered in urgent consultation, and Zimmermann, when he finally emerged from the command vehicle, looked directly at the farmhouse with an expression Marie could not decipher. The colonel stormed into the yard, his face purple with rage. "The American position was abandoned," he shouted. "Completely abandoned. Intelligence failure. Complete intelligence failure." He continued ranting, demanding investigations, threatening consequences. But through it all, Zimmermann remained silent, his eyes never leaving the farmhouse. That evening, after the other officers had departed and the regular garrison had settled back into their routine, Zimmermann came to the kitchen door. Henri answered, his body positioned protectively in front of his daughter. Zimmermann did not enter. He simply stood in the doorway, his face illuminated by the lamp Henri held. "I came to inform you," he said formally in French, "that there will be a change in garrison assignments. My unit is being transferred north. We leave tomorrow morning." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I also came to say that sometimes, in these difficult times, we encounter examples of courage that remind us of our own humanity. Such examples should be acknowledged, even when they cannot be publicly recognized." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, wrapped in paper. "Please give this to your daughter," he said, placing it in Henri's hand. "It is only chocolate, nothing more, but I want her to know that her actions, whatever they may have been noted by at least one person who understands the weight of moral choice." He stepped back, offered a slight, formal bow, and walked away into the darkness. Henri unwrapped the paper to find a bar of Swiss chocolate, real chocolate, not the ersatz substitute they had endured for years. Tucked inside the wrapping was a small note written in careful French. 760 reasons to believe in human decency. Thank you for reminding me that such decency still exists. May you and your family survive this conflict and see better days. KZ Marie kept that note for the rest of her life. She also kept the letter from Major Hendricks, though she did not open it until after the liberation of Belgium in September 1945. When she finally broke the seal, she found not just a letter of commendation, but testimonials from 12 different soldiers, each describing what Marie's warning had meant to them. Several included photographs, families they had returned to, children who existed because 760 men had not been trapped in that forest position. One letter came from Lieutenant Morrison. "I was wrong to doubt you," he wrote. "Not just wrong in judgment, but wrong in spirit. You showed more courage in one afternoon than I have shown in 2 years of this conflict. You also showed something more important than courage. You showed us that, in the midst of mechanized warfare and calculated strategy, there is still room for individual moral action. That one person, acting on conscience alone, can change the course of events that armies and generals set in motion. The official military records of December 16, 1944, show that elements of the 106th Infantry Division successfully withdrew from an exposed position near Malmedy, based on intelligence gathered from civilian sources. The planned German operation, intended to neutralize a significant American presence in the sector, found only abandoned positions and had to be reconfigured, losing crucial time and tactical advantage during the opening days of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Nowhere in those official records is Marie Delacroix mentioned by name. For decades, her role remained known only to her family, to the men she saved, and to one German officer who chose to acknowledge what she had done rather than report it to his superiors. It was not until 1989, 45 years after that frozen December day, that Marie's story began to emerge publicly. The historian researching personal accounts of the Battle of the Bulge discovered the letters that had been sent to a small Belgian farmhouse in the months after liberation. Following that thread, he found Marie, then 71 years old, living in Liège with her husband and 3 children. At first she was reluctant to discuss what she had done. "I was simply a girl who made a choice," she said. Thousands of people made similar choices during those years. Many of them paid a far higher price than I did. But the historian persisted, and eventually Marie agreed to tell her story in full. The account was published in 1991 and immediately attracted international attention. Veterans of the 106th Infantry Division, many now in their 70s and 80s, began coming forward with their own recollections of the mysterious Belgian girl who had appeared in their forest position with a warning that saved their lives. A reunion was arranged in 1993 in Washington, D.C. 17 survivors of that December day came to meet Marie in person. Among them was Jack Morrison, the skeptical sergeant who had initially doubted her story. He was 83 years old, walking with a cane, but his eyes were sharp and clear when he took Marie's hands in his. "I have waited 49 years to say this properly," he said. "Thank you. Thank you for being braver than any soldier I ever served with. Thank you for caring about the lives of men you had never met and would never see again. And thank you for teaching me that courage has nothing to do with uniforms or weapons, and everything to do with choosing to act when action requires risking everything." The reunion lasted 3 days. Marie met children and grandchildren who existed because their fathers and grandfathers had survived that December morning. She heard stories of lives lived, careers built, families raised, all made possible because 760 men had not been in a particular forest position when dawn broke on December 16, 1944. Major Hendricks had passed away in 1977, but his daughter attended the reunion. She brought the diary her father had kept during the conflict and read aloud his entry from December 15, 1944. "Today, a 16-year-old Belgian girl walked through 3 kilometers of frozen forest to warn us of an attack. She risked her life, her family's safety, and her country's brutal reprisals to save soldiers she did not know. I have commanded men through 2 years of this conflict and seen acts of valor that defied description, but I have never witnessed moral courage as pure and selfless as what this child demonstrated today. If we survive tomorrow, it will be because one girl believed that 760 lives mattered more than her own safety. The world should remember her name." Marie Delacroix. In 1995, Marie Delacroix was awarded the Bronze Star by the United States Army, one of only a handful of civilians to receive that honor. The Belgian government awarded her the Order of Leopold, the country's highest civilian decoration. But when asked about these honors, Marie always said the same thing. "I did what anyone with a conscience would do. The real heroes were the soldiers who fought for years to liberate my country. I simply gave them one more day to continue that fight." Marie Delacroix passed away in 2009 at the age of 81. Her funeral in Liège was attended by more than 300 people, including 7 surviving veterans of the 106th Infantry Division and representatives from 4 different military organizations. The eulogy was delivered by the grandson of Jack Morrison, a young man who existed because his grandfather had survived December 16, 1944. In her final years, Marie often spoke to school groups about her experience during the occupation. Her message was always the same. In times of darkness, when evil seems overwhelming and individual action appears meaningless, remember that one person acting on conscience can change the course of history. 760 lives were saved not by armies or strategy, but by one girl who chose to act when action was dangerous. That is the power each of us holds if we have the courage to use it. The farmhouse where Marie grew up still stands on its hillside overlooking the road between Malmedy and Stavelo. The barn where German forces maintained their depot has been converted into a small museum dedicated to civilian resistance during the occupation. Among the exhibits is the note Klaus Zimmermann left for Marie, mounted behind glass, a testament to the complicated humanity that could exist even in the midst of terrible conflict. Researchers have tried to locate Zimmermann after the conflict ended, hoping to learn more about his role in Marie's story. Records indicate he survived the conflict and returned to Munich, where he worked as an engineer until his passing in 1978. He never spoke publicly about his experiences during the conflict, and his family knew nothing of the Belgian girl whose actions he had quietly protected by arranging his unit's transfer before questions could be asked about how the American forces had learned of the planned operation. But in his personal effects, found after he passed away, was a photograph. It showed two young children, the same photograph Marie had seen him looking at that December morning. On the back, written in faded ink, was a single sentence in German that translated to, "Because of one girl's courage, I came home to see these faces again." The interconnected threads of that December day in 1944 extended far beyond what any of the participants could have known at the time. Among the 760 soldiers who were not in that forest position when it was surrounded was a young corporal named Robert Fletcher from Ohio. Fletcher survived the conflict, returned home, and became a teacher. One of his students was a boy named Neil Armstrong, who would go on to become the first human to walk on the moon. In an interview late in his life, Armstrong credited Fletcher as a key influence on his interest in aerospace. Another soldier, Private James Chen from California, survived to become a civil rights attorney who played a significant role in desegregation cases in the 1950s and 60s. Sergeant William O'Brien from Boston became a priest and spent 40 years working with homeless populations in major cities. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford from Virginia became a surgeon who pioneered techniques in cardiac surgery that saved thousands of lives. Each of these men, and hundreds of others, lived full lives that contributed to the world in ways large and small, all because a 16-year-old girl chose to act on her conscience during one frozen December afternoon. The ripple effects of that single choice extended across decades and oceans, touching lives that would never know Marie's name, but existed in part because of her courage. The historical lesson of Marie Delacroix's story extends beyond the immediate facts of December 1944. It speaks to the fundamental question of individual agency in the face of overwhelming systems. The occupation of Belgium, like the larger conflict of which it was part, was a machinery of nations and armies, of strategic decisions made in distant capitals, of forces that seemed to render individual choice meaningless. Yet, in one critical moment, that entire machinery bent around the moral choice of one person. 760 soldiers, representing hundreds of families, entire communities of future lives, were saved not by military intelligence or strategic brilliance, but by a teenage girl who decided that human lives mattered more than her own safety. This is perhaps the most profound lesson history offers, that systems, no matter how powerful, are ultimately composed of individual human beings making individual human choices, and that when one person chooses to act on moral principle, the consequences can resonate far beyond what any calculation could predict. Marie's story also illustrates the complicated nature of human behavior in times of conflict. Klaus Zimmermann, an officer in the German forces, was simultaneously a participant in occupation and a man capable of recognizing and protecting an act of conscience that directly undermined his military objectives. His choice to warn Marie, however subtly, and his later decision to transfer his unit before questions could arise about the intelligence failure, demonstrated that moral complexity existed even within the structures of war. The courage Marie demonstrated was not the courage of soldiers trained for combat. It was the courage of a civilian, a child, who had no obligation to risk anything, who had every reason to remain silent and safe. Her choice was purely moral, driven not by duty or orders, but by the simple recognition that she had the power to prevent tremendous loss of life and therefore the responsibility to try. In the decades since, military historians and ethicists have studied Marie's decision as an example of moral courage in its purest form. Unlike soldiers who act courageously in the heat of battle, driven by training and the immediate presence of their comrades, Marie had hours to consider her choice, to weigh the risks, to imagine the consequences for herself and her family. She chose to act anyway, with full knowledge of what she was risking. This kind of courage, divorced from the adrenaline of combat and the structure of military duty, represents something profound about human capacity for moral action. It suggests that under the right circumstances, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary choices, that the potential for heroism exists not just in soldiers or designated heroes, but in anyone who finds themselves in a position to act on conscience. The story also raises important questions about the nature of intelligence and trust in military operations. Lieutenant Morrison's initial skepticism toward Marie was not unreasonable from a tactical standpoint. Infiltration and deception were standard elements of the conflict. Trusting a civilian who appeared out of the forest with a warning about an attack was, by conventional military wisdom, risky at best and potentially catastrophic at worst. Yet in this case, conventional wisdom would have led to disaster. It was only the combination of Marie's desperate credibility and the later corroboration from reconnaissance that led to the decision to withdraw. The margin between survival and catastrophe was measured in hours and in the willingness of a few key decision-makers to trust an unlikely source. This tension between necessary skepticism and potentially life-saving trust remains relevant in contemporary contexts. How do we maintain appropriate caution while remaining open to information that challenges our assumptions? How do we evaluate sources when conventional credentials may not apply? Marie's story suggests that sometimes the most important intelligence comes from the least expected sources, and that rigid adherence to protocol can blind us to critical information. The preservation of Marie's story also speaks to the importance of documenting personal narratives of historical events. For 45 years, her role in saving 760 lives was known only to a small circle of people. It was only through the persistence of a single historian following a thread of old letters that her story emerged into public knowledge. How many similar stories remain unknown, lost to time because no one thought to record them, or because the participants believed their actions were too ordinary to merit attention? Marie herself resisted recognition for decades, seeing her choice as simply what any decent person would do. This humility is characteristic of many who perform acts of great courage. They do not see themselves as heroes, but as people who happen to be in a position to help and therefore helped. Yet it is precisely these stories of ordinary people making extraordinary choices that provide the most powerful examples of human potential. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.